Wilhelmina Collins had sold everything she owned, including her mother's silver hairbrush and the last 3 laying hens, to buy a train ticket west, and she was not entirely certain the man she was riding toward even remembered her name. The year was 1878, and the dust of Kansas still clung to her boots from 2 states back. She had passed through Missouri in the dead of night on the iron horse, watching the black silhouettes of oak trees give way to the flat, endless promise of the frontier. She had crossed Indiana before that, said goodbye to the small white house on Birch Street where she had spent 24 years of her life learning to be patient, to be quiet, to fold herself small so that the world might not notice how much space she truly wanted to take up. She was done with all of that now. She had burned the patience down to the ground when the letter arrived, the one that was not even addressed to her, the one she had found tucked behind the loose board in her late father's writing desk, the one that had changed everything. The letter was from Marshall Warren. She had known Marshall Warren for exactly 11 days. That was 4 years ago, in the autumn of 1874, when he had passed through Cloverdale, Indiana. On his way west with a cattle drive he was riding for a rancher out of Texas. He had been 26 then, lean and sun-darkened, with dark eyes that caught the late afternoon light like creek water catching copper. He had stayed at her father's boarding house on account of a lamed horse, and in those 11 days, Wilhelmina had fallen into a kind of love she had no adequate language for. It was not the soft, manageable affection of the novels her friend Clara pressed into her hands. It was the kind that sat in the chest like a stone you did not want removed because the weight of it reminded you that you were alive. They had talked every evening. He had sat on the porch with her and told her about the land out west, about New Mexico territory, about a sky so wide it made a man feel both insignificant and enormous at once. He had told her about the Pecos River, about the way the light fell over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains at dusk, the way it turned the rock faces red and gold, as though the whole world were on fire in the most beautiful way possible. He had told her he was going to settle there one day. He was going to stop drifting. She had told him about her drawings. She had shown him the sketchbook she kept hidden under her mattress because her father thought artistic pursuits were a waste of a woman's time, and Marshall Warren had sat under the porch lantern and turned each page with a carefulness that made her throat ache. He had said, in that quiet way of his, that the world would be lesser without people who noticed it the way she did. On the last evening, before his horse was ready and the cattle drive waited, and the whole weight of his practical life reasserted itself, he had held her hand in both of his on the porch step and said nothing for a very long time. Then he had said he wished things were different. She had not known what to say to that, and he had ridden out at first light, and she had watched the dust settle on the road and told herself it was just 11 days. It was just a cowboy passing through. It was just the romance of a moment and nothing lasting. For 4 years she had almost convinced herself. Then the letter fell out from behind the board in her father's desk, the day she was clearing the house after the funeral. Her father had died quietly, a heart that had been failing for some time, finally giving up on a Tuesday in September. She had been sorting through his papers, the meticulous ledgers and receipts of a boarding house keeper, when the envelope had come loose and fluttered to the floor. It was addressed to her father from a Marshall Warren, postmarked from a town called Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, dated July of 1877, a full year past. Her father had never shown it to her. Her father had kept it. She had read it standing on the bare floorboards of the empty study, with her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it. Marshall Warren had written to her father asking after Wilhelmina. He had written with a formality that was clearly costing him considerable effort, the sentences stiff and careful in the way of a man more accustomed to action than words. He had explained that he had settled in Redemption Creek, that he had a modest cattle operation going, that he had thought about her more than was probably sensible, and that he wanted to know if she was well, and if she was perhaps still unmarried, and if her father might consider allowing him to write to her directly, as he had not been able to stop thinking about her since Indiana. Her father had never replied. Her father, who had wanted her to marry the miller's son from 3 streets over, a perfectly adequate man named Gerald who smelled of grain and obligation, had taken the letter and hidden it and never said a single word. Wilhelmina had stood in that empty room and felt 4 years of patient waiting crystallize into something sharp and decisive. She had put the letter in her coat pocket. She had finished clearing the house. She had sold the boarding house to the family, who had been renting the downstairs rooms. She had sold the hens and the silver hairbrush and the oak writing desk itself, and she had bought a ticket to Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, by way of the Kansas Pacific Railway, and whatever wagon or stagecoach or sheer determination was required thereafter. She had crossed 3 states to find a man who did not know she was coming. The train pulled into Dodge City, Kansas, on a Thursday evening in late October, and Wilhelmina stepped onto the platform with a carpet bag, a worn leather sketchbook, and a stubbornness that had gotten her through 24 years of being underestimated. Dodge City in 1878 was still loud and raw, a cattle town at the height of its strange, violent glory. She could hear music from the saloons even before she fully descended the platform steps, and the street beyond was a river of horses and cowhands and commerce and dust. She needed to find passage south into New Mexico Territory. The train went no further in the direction she needed, and she had known this before she left, had researched it as carefully as she could from Cloverdale with access only to a 2-year-old almanac and the advice of the post office clerk, who had been to Kansas once and considered himself an expert on the entire American West. The station agent, a narrow man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, told her the next southbound freight wagon left on Saturday morning from a freight yard on the south end of town, run by a man named Abbott Hins. He told her this in the tone of someone conveying information they expected to be useless, studying her with the particular skepticism that men in positions of minor authority often reserved for women traveling alone. She thanked him politely and walked out into Dodge City. She found a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Opal Granger, 3 blocks from the main strip, far enough from the saloons that the piano music was a murmur rather than a shout. Mrs. Granger was a stout woman in her 50s with a sharp eye and a kind face, and she took one look at Wilhelmina, assessed the situation with the efficiency of a woman who had seen most of what life had to offer, and showed her to a clean room on the 2nd floor without requiring much in the way of explanation. Over a supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread, Wilhelmina told Mrs. Granger where she was headed, and Mrs. Granger set down her fork and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. "Redemption Creek," Mrs. Granger said. "That is a real place, I will say that for it. My late husband freighted goods out that direction in '74. You have a relation there?" "Not exactly," Wilhelmina said. Mrs. Granger studied her for a moment. "A man, then?" Wilhelmina did not see much use in pretending otherwise. "A man," she confirmed. Mrs. Granger picked up her fork again. "Well," she said, in a tone that contained multitudes, "you had better hope Abbott Hins is taking the freight road south and not the Mesa route, because the Mesa route in late October is not fit for a wagon, let alone a woman in traveling clothes." Abbott Hins turned out to be a large, sun-weathered man in his 40s, who operated the freight service with 2 wagons, 3 mules, and a rotating crew of drivers. He was gruff in the way of practical men who had no patience for formality, but he was not unkind. When Wilhelmina presented herself at the freight yard on Friday morning to arrange her passage rather than waiting until Saturday, he looked at her carpet-bag and her determined expression, and said that he could get her to a town called Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, which was the southernmost point of his regular route, and from Cimarron she would need to arrange her own passage southeast to Redemption Creek, which was another 70 miles or so. "70 miles is a significant distance for a woman on her own," he said. He said it as a statement, not as a prohibition, which she appreciated. "I am aware," she said. "I am still going." He charged her $4.50 for the passage, which was more than she had hoped but less than she had feared, and he told her to be at the yard at sunrise Saturday with no more luggage than she could carry herself, because his mules had enough to pull without adding a woman's steamer trunk to the list. She had no steamer trunk. She had her carpet bag and her sketchbook and the letter in her coat pocket, and that was sufficient. The freight rode south from Dodge City into the territory, was 2 days of wagon jolting and November cold wind that came down from the mountains in the north, and made the flat grassland feel like the edge of the world. Abbott Hines drove the lead wagon himself, and turned out to be surprisingly good company, possessed of an enormous store of stories about the territory and the people in it, shared in a dry, unhurried voice that made the miles pass more easily. His driver on the second wagon, a young Mexican man named Tomás, barely said 10 words the entire journey, but handled his mules with a quiet competence that impressed her. Abbott Hines told her about Redemption Creek over supper on the first night, when they had camped in a dry ravine with a fire built small against the wind. "It is a real town now," he said, meaning it was not the kind of raw settlement that sprang up and blew away with the season. "Had a proper schoolhouse built last year, got a church, got a mercantile, got a sheriff and a telegraph office. It is the kind of town that intends to stay. Do you know a man named Marshall Warren?" She asked, and she tried to ask it in a way that was casual, as though she were simply gathering information, as though her entire future were not hanging on the answer. Abbott Hines looked at her over the fire. "Warren," he said, "running cattle out near the Agua Fria Flats, quiet man, does not make trouble. I have hauled supplies to his place twice." He paused. "He is a good man, if that is what you are asking." She looked into the fire and let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 days. "That is what I was asking," she said. They reached Cimarron on the afternoon of the second day. It was a small but established town, sitting at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, with a dignity that came from having survived the various violences and absurdities of territorial life. The mountains above it were exactly as Marshall Warren had described them, red and gold in the late afternoon light, the sky above them the deep, impossible blue of high-altitude October. She stood on the main street of Cimarron with her carpetbag at her feet and looked at those mountains, and for the first time since leaving Indiana, she felt not urgency and anxiety but something that was almost peace. This was the land he had told her about. She was standing in the landscape of his words. Abbott Hines, before driving his wagon to the freight warehouse, pointed her toward a general store whose owner, a man named Caldwell, he said would know who was riding south toward Redemption Creek. Caldwell's general store was a narrow, fragrant space packed with everything from flour to firearms, presided over by a man built like a barrel, short and round and immovable, who turned out to be extremely well informed about the comings and goings of the region. He listened to her situation without visible surprise, which suggested he had seen stranger things. "You need a ride to Redemption Creek," he said. "I have a man who runs dry goods down that way every other week. He was here yesterday, so he will not be back for a fortnight." He scratched his jaw. "However, Jed Carver is riding south tomorrow morning. He has a ranch near Redemption Creek, outside of town about 4 miles. He is a decent man, and he has a wagon because he bought lumber. I could ask him." She said yes before he finished the sentence. Jed Carver was a rancher in his late 30s, a compact, weathered man with a sun-cracked face and a gentleness that sat oddly but genuinely on him, the way gentleness often did on men who had spent their lives doing physical work. He agreed to carry her without apparent hesitation when Caldwell made the introduction, saying only that the wagon would not be comfortable on account of the lumber, but she was welcome to it. She told him she was looking for Marshall Warren's place, and Jed Carver looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. "You know Marshall?" he asked. "I knew him 4 years ago," she said. "In Indiana." Another unreadable pause. Then he said, "All right," in a tone that suggested he had decided to simply carry her where she was going and let the rest sort itself out, which was, she thought, the only sensible approach. They left Cimarron at first light, and the road south through the territory was the most beautiful thing Wilhelmina Collins had ever seen in her life. The Sangre de Cristo Range flanked them to the east, red and enormous in the morning sun, and the land before them was a wide golden sweep of high desert grassland dotted with piñon pine and juniper. The sky above it so vast it made her understand for the first time why a person might feel both small and free at once. She had her sketchbook on her knees and she drew as the wagon rolled, Jed Carver driving his mules in comfortable silence, filling page after page with the mountains and the light and the scrub oak along the dry creek beds. She had always felt, a better observer than a talker. The world came clearest to her through the end of a charcoal pencil. Jed Carver glanced at her drawing once at a stop to water the mules and said, "That is very good," with the surprise of someone who had expected less. She thanked him. He was quiet for a while longer, and then, as the afternoon stretched toward its golden end, he said, "Marshall Warren is a good man. I want you to know that. He has not had the easiest time of it out here, starting a spread from nothing, but he has never been anything but honest and decent. I think you probably already know that, but I thought I should say it." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" He thought about it. "Because you crossed 3 states on your own to get here," he said. "I figure you deserve to know that it was worth the trouble." She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that went beyond politeness. Redemption Creek announced itself first as a water tower, and then as a line of buildings against the late afternoon sky, low and dusty and real, smoke rising from chimneys in the cooling air. It was a small town, as towns in the territory went, but it had the settled, purposeful look of a place that had decided to last. A main street with a mercantile, a sheriff's office, a small hotel, a church whose white paint was fresh enough to still be startling, a schoolhouse at the far end. People moving about in the last light of the day, going home to suppers, to families, to the ordinary rhythms that made civilization out of wilderness. Jed Carver pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the hotel, a 2-story building with a narrow porch, and helped her down with her carpetbag. "Marshall's place is about 6 miles east of town," he said. "I can draw you a map, or you can ask at the mercantile tomorrow. Reardon at the mercantile knows where everything is." She looked at the hotel, then at the street, and felt the peculiar vertigo of having arrived. She had been moving for so long, had been in the state of going for so long, that stopping felt strange, almost wrong, like a river that had suddenly come upon flat ground and did not know quite what to do with all that momentum. "Tomorrow," she said. "I will go tomorrow." She needed one night to think, one night to practice the words she had been saying in her head since Indiana. The hotel was clean and spare, run by a man named Decker and his wife, Lara, who was warm-faced and efficient, and gave her a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked east toward the mountains. She ate supper in the small dining room downstairs, a plate of roasted chicken and potatoes and green beans, and she drank coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening, the distant piano from somewhere down the street, the calling of voices, the clop of horses on packed earth. After supper, she sat at the small desk in her room and took the letter from her coat pocket and read it again. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She read his careful, effortful words, this man who was more comfortable on horseback than on paper, and she thought about what it had cost him to write them, and about what it had cost her father to hide them. She did not hate her father for it. She had thought she might, but she did not. He had been a frightened, small-hearted man who had loved her in the only cramped way he knew how. He had been wrong, and his wrongness had cost her 4 years, and she was going to claim what those years had taken from her. That was enough. grief and anger and grief again, and then you simply went east to west and found the thing that was yours. In the morning she wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool she had bought in Dodge City with the last of her spending money, because she had thought, standing at the counter in the dry goods store with the bolts of fabric in front of her, that if there was ever a moment to spend money on a dress, it was this one. She braided her dark hair and pinned it up and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin, and said to her own reflection firmly that she was Wilhelmina Collins, that she had come a very long way and that she was not going to be afraid. She was afraid, but she went anyway. That was, she had always thought, the true definition of courage. Reardon at the Mercantile, a thin young man with a cheerful disposition, gave her directions to the Warren spread with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed being helpful. 6 miles east on the main road, then north at the fork where the big cottonwood had been split by lightning, then another 1.5 miles along the ridge, and the place would come into view below. She hired a horse from the livery, a steady gray mare the stable keeper said was reliable on rocky ground. She was not a natural rider, but she was competent, had ridden horses around Cloverdale all her life. She tied her carpetbag to the saddle and rode east out of Redemption Creek as the morning was still young and cold and bright, the mountains ahead of her catching the early light like they were trying to announce something. The land was open and rolling, scattered with pinon and juniper and occasional stands of tall grass gone tawny with the season. She passed a hawk sitting on a fence post who watched her with profound indifference. She crossed a dry creek bed where the cottonwoods stood bare and gold, and she thought about how in 3 months those cottonwoods would be bare and cold and dead-looking, and in 6 months they would be green again, and how the world kept cycling through its changes regardless of whether any individual human being had the courage to do the same. The split cottonwood was exactly where Reardon had said it would be. She took the North Fork. She saw the ranch from the ridge. It was a modest operation as such things went, but it had the look of something built with care and intention. A long, low adobe house, pale as sand, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. A solid-looking barn, recently repaired from the look of the new timber on one side. A corral with 4 horses in it, a haystack, a pump and trough, a small kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the winter. Smoke coming from the chimney of the house in a straight white line, which meant the air was still and cold. A man was in the corral working with one of the horses. She knew, even from this distance, from the way he moved, from the set of his shoulders. She sat on the gray mare at the top of the ridge and watched him for a moment. She watched the easy, purposeful way he moved around the horse, unhurried and quiet. She watched him and she thought about an evening on a porch in Indiana with a lantern throwing yellow light over the pages of her sketchbook, and a man who had looked at her drawings like they were worth seeing. She had crossed 3 states for this. She touched her heels to the mare's sides and started down the ridge. He did not notice her until she was within 50 yards. He had his back to the approach, working with the horse, and it was the horse that saw her first, lifting its head and shifting its weight in that particular way horses had when something new entered their world. Marshal Warren turned. He stood very still. She pulled the mare to a stop at the fence rail of the corral, and he crossed the corral slowly, his expression one she could not yet read from this distance. And she thought, for one terrible moment, what if the letter was old, what if he had moved on? What if 4 years had made a woman from Indiana nothing more than a distant, hazy memory? Then she saw his face clearly, and she knew she had worried for nothing. He looked like a man who had just seen something he had given up on. "Wilhelmina Collins," he said, and her name in his voice after 4 years was like finding water after a long crossing. "Hello, Marshal Warren," she said, and her voice was steadier than she deserved credit for. He opened the corral gate and came out and stood by the mare's head, looking up at her. He had aged 4 years, as people did, but the aging had done him no harm. He was still lean, still sun-darkened, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now, his jaw carrying a few days of dark stubble. The dark eyes were exactly as she remembered them, and they were looking at her now with an intensity that made it difficult to think clearly. "What are you doing here?" he said, and then immediately, as if correcting himself, "I mean, how, you are here." "I am here," she agreed. She swung down from the mare without waiting for him to help, because she was not the kind of woman who waited for help when she did not need it, and she stood on the ground in front of him with her hands at her sides and looked at him squarely. "I found your letter," she said, "the one you wrote to my father in July of last year." Something moved across his face. "He never replied," Marshall said. "I thought he had made his position clear by the silence." "He never showed it to me," she said. "I found it after he died in September behind a board in his writing desk. He kept it hidden." Marshall Warren looked at her for a long moment. The wind came down off the mountains and moved through the dry grass and stirred the brim of his hat. "He kept it hidden," he said quietly. "He kept it hidden," she confirmed. "And I came to tell you that, and to tell you that I have thought about you for 4 years, which is a great deal of thinking to do about a man you spent 11 days with, but I have found that I cannot seem to stop, and I thought you had a right to know." There was a silence. A long, breathing, significant silence, with the mountains watching and the smoke going straight up from the chimney and the horses in the corral stamping gently at the cold ground. "You came from Indiana," he said. "I came from Indiana." "Through Kansas. That is a very long way. I am aware, 3 states I counted." He looked at her for another long moment, and then something in his expression shifted into something open and almost helpless, and he said, "Wilhelmina, I have been trying to stop thinking about you for 4 years too." She felt the breath go out of her in a way that was not unpleasant. "Well," she said, "now you do not have to." He smiled then for the first time, and it was the same smile she remembered from Indiana, the one that started slow and then broke wide. And she thought, standing in the cold October light in New Mexico territory with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains going red in the morning sun, that it had absolutely been worth 3 states. He took her horse's bridle, and they walked together to the barn, and he settled the mare in an empty stall with hay and water, with the automatic efficiency of a man who had been tending animals all his life. Wilhelmina stood in the barn doorway watching him, and the words that had been rehearsed and re-rehearsed during 3 states of transit all fell away, because she did not need them now. The rehearsed words had been armor, she realized. The words for if he had forgotten her, for if he was indifferent, for if the letter had been a polite inquiry and nothing more. None of those were the situation she was actually in. When he was done with the horse, he turned and found her watching him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Come inside," he said. "It is cold and I have coffee." The house was exactly as she might have imagined it if she had allowed herself to imagine it, which she had tried not to do. Low-ceilinged and warm, the adobe walls thick enough to hold the heat of the fire in the stone hearth. Simple furniture, a table of dark wood, 2 chairs, a bookshelf with a respectable number of books, a Navajo blanket on the wall, its geometric patterns vivid against the white plaster. On the table, a set of surveying maps. On the windowsill, a tin cup of dried wildflowers that had been there long enough to be dusty, which struck her as unexpectedly tender, the kind of small private keeping of beauty that a person did not usually admit to. He poured her coffee from the pot on the stove, and they sat at the table, and the morning light came through the south-facing window and fell between them on the dark wood. She took the letter from her coat pocket and set it on the table. He looked at it for a moment, recognizing it, and then looked at her. "I should not have waited so long to contact you," he said. "After Indiana, I should have written to you directly. I did not because I thought—" He stopped, choosing his words with the same careful effort she recognized from his written ones. "I thought I had no right to ask you to come out here when I did not yet have anything worth coming to. And by the time I did, 4 years had passed, and I thought it was too late." "It is not too late," she said. "No," he agreed. "It does not seem to be." She wrapped her hands around the tin cup and let its warmth seep into her fingers. Outside the window, a crow landed on the fence rail of the corral and regarded the world with crow-like authority. The fire crackled. The mountains were visible from the south window, their red peaks bright in the morning. "Tell me about the spread," she said. "Tell me what you have built here." And so he did. He told her about the 140 acres he had filed on 4 years ago, about the cattle he had started with, 12 head bought with everything he had saved from 3 years of trail work, about the hard first winter when he had lost 2 to a blizzard and had nearly lost everything. He told her about the water rights he had fought for, legally and with considerable stubbornness, against a larger rancher to the south named Cowboy, who had tried to dam the creek that ran through the northern edge of his land. He had won that fight through the territorial court, which had taken 8 months and had cost him money he did not have, but the water was secured, and the cattle were watered and the land was producing. He had 83 head of cattle now. He had the hay contract with the Army post at Fort Union, 20 miles north. He had the house and the barn and the corral and the 4 horses and the kitchen garden that in summer produced enough vegetables to keep him through to the following spring. He had built something real. She could see it in how he talked about it, not with boasting but with the quiet satisfaction of a person who had made something out of nothing through sheer sustained effort. "It is a good place," she said. "It is a good place," he agreed. He looked at her across the table. "I always thought when I had it right enough that I might write again, but I did not know what your situation was. 4 years is a long time." "I am not married," she said, in case that needed stating. "I had hoped," he said. "I mean." "I am glad," she smiled at him. He smiled back and then looked at his coffee, and then at the window, and she thought that he was a man who felt things very deeply and was not entirely comfortable with how much he was feeling right now. She found that enormously endearing. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have very little money remaining. I sold everything I had to get here. I have my clothes and my sketchbook and approximately $4, and that is the full accounting of my material circumstances." He looked at her steadily. "You sold everything you had to get here." "I did. Wilhelmina." He said her name in a tone she did not have a word for. "You should have written to me. I would have come to Indiana." "I know," she said, "but I had been waiting for 4 years for someone to come to me, and I thought it was time I went toward something instead." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him sitting with that, turning it over. Then he said, "I am very glad you did." She thought that was probably the truest thing that had been said on either side of the Mississippi that week. They talked through the morning and into the afternoon, and she noticed as the hours passed that the careful formality of the early conversation was loosening, giving way to something more like the evenings in Indiana, the easy back and forth of 2 people who had recognized something in each other early and had not forgotten it. He asked about her drawing, and she showed him the sketchbook, the pages from the journey west, the Missouri River at night from the train window, the flat Kansas horizon, the mountains as she had first seen them from Abbott Hint's wagon. He turned the pages with the same carefulness she remembered, the same expression of genuine attention. "You are better than you were," he said. "I have had 4 years to practice," she said. "It was the thing I did instead of thinking about you." He looked up from the sketchbook. "Did it work?" "Somewhat," she said. "I became quite good at drawing." He laughed at that, a real, unguarded laugh, and she felt it in her chest like a bell rung close. He made her dinner, which was a better meal than she had expected from a man living alone, beans and dried beef and cornbread and dried apricots, and they ate at the table as the afternoon light went long and warm through the windows. Outside, the mountains had gone from red to purple, the sky above them already deepening toward the first stars. The question of where she would stay had been in the room all day, unaddressed. The town was 6 miles distant. It was getting dark. Marshal Warren addressed it with the directness of a practical man. "You should stay here tonight," he said. "I will sleep in the barn. The bedroom is yours." He said it in a tone that made absolutely clear this was a matter of practicality and nothing else, which she appreciated both for its honesty and its decency. "I will not put you out of your own bedroom," she said. "I can sleep in the chair by the fire." "You will not sleep in the chair," he said, in the tone of a man who had made up his mind. You have been traveling for nearly 2 weeks. You will sleep in the bed." She thought about arguing and decided it was not a battle worth fighting. "Thank you," she said. "Tomorrow," he said, and then he paused, choosing his words again. "Tomorrow I would like to take you into town. There are some people I would like you to meet, and I would like to show you the rest of the spread if you would like to see it." "I would like that very much," she said. He showed her the bedroom, which was simple and clean, and found her an extra blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed, and said good night with a formality that was slightly at odds with the warmth of the rest of the day, as if he were keeping a careful distance, not from coldness but from care. She lay in his bed under his blanket and listened to the silence of the territory, which was not truly silent, but was a different kind of sound than anything she had known in Indiana. Coyotes somewhere to the north, the wind in the juniper outside the window, the occasional stamp of a horse in the corral, the fire in the main room slowly going to coals. She thought she had never in her life felt more exactly in the right place. In the morning he was already up when she woke, the smell of coffee and bacon coming under the bedroom door. She dressed and came out to find the table set and the fire rebuilt, and he poured her coffee without being asked, and they ate breakfast together in the early morning light with an ease that felt as if it had been there all along, just waiting to be inhabited. After breakfast he showed her the spread. He saddled 2 horses and they rode out across the land he had built his life on, and he was different out here than he was in the house, more expansive, more himself in the way that people were when they were on their own ground. He showed her the northern edge where the creek ran, the cottonwood grove where the cattle sheltered in the worst of the summer heat, the natural spring that he had developed into a reliable water source. He showed her the place on the ridge where, on clear days, he said you could see all the way to the mountains east of Santa Fe. It was clear, and they could. She stood on the ridge on her horse and looked at that enormous distance and felt something in her that had been cramped and contracted for a very long time begin to open. "I want to draw all of it," she said. He glanced at her. "Then you should. Marshall." She said his name and he looked at her, and she had not planned to say this yet, had planned to be patient, to give it time, but she had spent 4 years being patient and she was done with it. "I want to stay, not just visiting. I want to stay here." The horses moved in the wind. The mountains held their ground. "Wilhelmina," he said, "I have been trying to think of how to ask you to stay since you rode down that ridge yesterday morning." She felt the smile come before she could stop it. "Then we are in agreement. There would need to be a wedding," he said, and he said it not as a condition but as a statement of what he wanted, which was different and mattered. "I would not have you here otherwise, not properly. I would not have you treated with anything less than full respect." "I had assumed," she said. "You are a man of considerable scruples, Marshall Warren. I noticed that 4 years ago." "You noticed that," he said with a slight smile. "I noticed everything about you," she said. "In 11 days I noticed more about you than I have noticed about most people in a lifetime. That is what made the 4 years so inconvenient." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. It was the same as it had been on the porch in Indiana, both of her hands in both of his, warm and careful, and she thought about how some things did not change across 4 years and 3 states and all the distance in between. "I will speak to the Reverend tomorrow," he said. "I have nothing to wear," she said. "I mean, for a wedding, my blue dress is the best I have." "The blue dress is fine," he said. "I have not seen you in the blue dress yet, but I am certain the blue dress is fine." She laughed, and he smiled, and below them the land went on in all its wide and beautiful promise. They rode back down to the house in the afternoon light, and as they came over the last rise before the house, Wilhelmina saw a rider coming up the road from the south. A woman on a dark horse, moving at a comfortable pace, and even at a distance there was something in the way she rode that suggested purpose. Marshall saw her too, and his expression became something between recognition and resigned amusement. "That is a leaner hatch," he said. "She has the neighboring spread to the south. Widow runs it herself. She has a particular gift for knowing when something is happening and arriving in time to be part of it." Alina Hatch turned out to be a woman of about 40, with strong hands and a direct gaze and a manner that was brisk without being unkind. She pulled up her horse, assessed Wilhelmina with complete thoroughness in about 4 seconds, and said to Marshall, "Caldwell at the Mercantile told me you had a visitor. From Indiana." "Caldwell talks too much," Marshall said, without genuine annoyance. "Caldwell is the central information system of this entire county," Alina said. She extended her hand to Wilhelmina. "Alina Hatch, Wilhelmina Collins." "Indiana," Alina said. "Indiana," Wilhelmina confirmed. Alina looked between them with the expression of a person putting together a picture that had been left in pieces for some time. "Well," she said, in a tone that contained satisfaction and something like approval, "it is about time." She looked at Marshall. "I have been telling you for 2 years that you needed something in your life besides cattle and surveying maps." "You have been saying that," Marshall agreed. "And here she is," Alina said, as though Wilhelmina's arrival were a particularly well-timed piece of evidence in a long-standing argument. Alina Hatch stayed for coffee and turned out to be the kind of woman who, once she had decided to like you, made that decision known thoroughly and without reservation. She told Wilhelmina everything she would need to know about Redemption Creek in the space of 1 hour, the social hierarchy, the politics, who was fair and who was not, where to buy the best flour, which families had been in the territory for decades and which were newly arrived from the east and still finding their footing. She told her about the Navajo families who had land to the west and with whom the Warren spread had always had a respectful relationship, and about the Apache families further south who had suffered the worst of what the territorial years had brought and whose patience with certain aspects of American governance was, as Alina put it with stark honesty, entirely earned. Wilhelmina listened carefully to all of it, because she was the kind of person who believed that knowing the truth about a place was the first obligation of living in it. When Alina left in the early evening, she squeezed Wilhelmina's hand and said, quietly, just for her, "He is a good man. He has been lonely a long time. Take care of each other." "That is my full intention," Wilhelmina said. Marshall Warren and Wilhelmina Collins were married on a Saturday in early November, 1878, in the small white church in Redemption Creek, by a reverend named Matthias Cole, who had the comfortable manner of a man who had performed many weddings in many weathers and found them all worth doing. The church was not full, but it was not empty either. Jed Carver came, and his wife, a small bright-eyed woman named Ruth, who had brought flowers wrapped in brown paper and pressed them into Wilhelmina's hands at the door with an emotion entirely out of proportion to how recently they had met. But that was somehow entirely right. Alina Hatch sat in the front pew and looked proud of herself. Caldwell from the Mercantile came because he said he had a personal investment in anything that had started as a conversation over directions. Tomas, the young driver from Abbott Hinn's freight run, was in Redemption Creek on a delivery and came in and sat in the back pew with his hat in his hands. Mrs. Lara Decker from the hotel came with her husband and a ranching family named Vasquez, who had been Marshall's neighbors to the north for 3 years and were warm and genuine in their welcome. Wilhelmina wore the blue dress and had her dark hair loose because she had decided that if she was going to get married in a dress she had bought in Dodge City with her last spending money, she was going to do it the way she wanted. Marshall wore his best shirt, which was clean and pressed in a way that suggested he had done this preparation himself with considerable care, and when she came through the church door and he turned and saw her, his face went through a sequence of expressions so unguarded and clear that she heard the woman sitting nearest the aisle let out a quiet sound of pure delight. Reverend Cole performed the service with warmth and without excessive duration, and when it was done and the vows were said and the ring was on her finger, a simple band Marshall had bought from the silversmith on the far end of Main Street, Marshall Warren kissed his wife with a restraint appropriate to the setting that still managed to convey a great deal. There was a gathering afterward at the Decker Hotel's back room, which Mrs. Decker had decorated with dried flowers and oil lamps, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced an accordion, and Redemption Creek turned out to be the kind of town that knew how to make a celebration out of modest materials. Wilhelmina danced with Marshall in the lamplight, and she thought about all the ordinary evenings that were ahead of them now, and she found that the ordinary evenings were the things she wanted most in the world. The first weeks of their marriage were the weeks of learning each other in the full, daily way that being together required. She learned that he was a man who woke before dawn without exception, who drank his first cup of coffee in silence on the porch watching the mountains turn from dark to light, who found this ritual so fundamental to his functioning that interrupting it was, as he put it once with gentle humor, not something he recommended. She learned that he read at night, serious books, histories and agricultural texts and the occasional novel, and that he was not embarrassed about the novel. She learned that he had a tendency to take on more than he should and to say less about how it was going than he should, and that the way to address this was to ask him direct questions and wait out the pause until the real answer came. He learned that she was a woman who needed time alone with her sketchbook every day, not as an optional pleasure but as a genuine necessity of her nature, and that if she did not have it, she became a person who was technically present but functionally somewhere else. He learned that she was a better cook than he was, which was not a particularly high bar given that his standard had been bachelor rancher, but she was genuinely good, and the kitchen became her domain with a naturalness that had nothing to do with it being expected of her, and everything to do with it being a thing she was good at and found satisfying. He learned that she had opinions about virtually everything, and that the opinions were generally sound, and that the thing she was least able to tolerate was dishonesty, and so he made sure to be honest with her even when the truth was inconvenient. She drew everything. She drew the mountains at every hour of the day, because they were never the same mountain twice. She drew the cattle in the morning light, and the horses in the corral and the kitchen garden as it slept under its winter covering of straw. She drew a leaner hatch on her dark horse crossing the southern field, a figure of such particular competence and purpose that the drawing came out looking like a portrait of someone to be reckoned with. Eleanor, when she was shown it, said it was the best thing she had ever seen of herself, and hung it on the wall of her house. The winter was cold and genuine, and Marshall had been right that the adobe walls held the heat, and the nights were long and firelit and good. They learned each other in all the ways that people do when they are newly married and happy about it. In March, as the weather was beginning its slow turn toward spring, and the kitchen garden was beginning to be planned, Wilhelmina told Marshall she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast, at the table with the morning light coming through the south window, and he sat very still for a moment and then reached across the table and took her hand in the same way he always did, both hands around hers, and said, in a voice that was quiet and sure, that he was the most fortunate man in New Mexico territory. "That is possibly an overstatement," she said. "It is not," he said. "It is an accurate accounting." She laughed, and he brought her hand to his lips, and the mountains outside the window turned gold in the spring morning light. Their son was born in November of 1879, a year to the month after their wedding, in the same bedroom where Wilhelmina had slept her first night on the spread. Eleanor Hatch attended the birth with the practical efficiency of a woman who had helped bring a number of calves into the world and was not easily unnerved, and Marshall was in the next room making enough noise walking back and forth that Wilhelmina could track him through the wall. When Eleanor came out and told him he had a son, the sound he made was one Wilhelmina heard clearly from the bedroom, and she thought she had never heard a more satisfying sound in her life. They named him James Thomas Warren, James for the straightforwardness of it and Thomas for Marshall's father, who had died when Marshall was young, and of whom he spoke with a quiet love that she had come to understand was one of the fundamental things about him. James Warren was, from the beginning, a child of considerable personality. He was loud and determined and curious about everything, and he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness, which Eleanor Hatch said was a combination that would either produce something extraordinary or a great deal of trouble, and most likely both in alternating measure. Marshall Warren took to fatherhood the way he took to most things, which was quietly and completely. She would find him in the morning standing over James in the cradle with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder, as though the baby were a fact about the world that he was still in the process of absorbing. He carried James on the morning rounds when the weather was fair, tucked against his chest, and James regarded the mountains and the horses and the wide sky with the attentive calm of a person encountering things they already somehow recognized. The spread grew. By the spring of 1880, Marshall had 112 head of cattle and had taken on a hand, a young man named Felipe from a family in Cimarron, who was 19 and serious, and worked with a diligence that quickly made him indispensable. Felipe had a sister, Catalina, who sometimes helped Wilhelmina in the house during the busy seasons, and the two families developed the comfortable, interdependent relationship of neighbors who genuinely liked each other. Catalina had an eye for color and a gift for the embroidery traditional to her family's region, and she and Wilhelmina spent many evenings at the table together, one with needle and thread, and one with charcoal and paper, making things in companionable quiet. Redemption Creek was growing too. A doctor arrived in 1880, a young man named Dr. Sutton who had trained in St. Louis and come west with the particular idealism of someone who wanted to be needed and was not disappointed. A lawyer followed that autumn. A second church was built, serving the Spanish-speaking families who made up a substantial portion of the territory's population and who had been making the uncomfortable accommodation of attending the English-language church for want of other options, which Wilhelmina thought was a situation long overdue for addressing. The new church had a bell that rang on Sunday mornings and could be heard from the Warren spread on clear days. The injustice of the territory was not invisible to her. She had arrived in the West with an Easterner's theoretical knowledge and no lived experience of what the conquest of the frontier actually looked like from the ground. What she found, looking clearly and honestly the way she had been trained to look by 4 years of careful drawing, was a land that had been inhabited and loved by people long before it was ever a territory or a state or a concept in an American politician's manifest destiny. She saw the Navajo families to the west, still healing from the devastation of the Long Walk, which had ended only a decade before, still reassembling themselves after a displacement so brutal it required a specifically chosen word. She saw the Apache families further south navigating a relationship with the territorial authorities that ranged from contentious to outright hostile, depending on who was currently in which office. She talked about what she saw with Marshall, who had been in the territory long enough to have formed his own clear-eyed view of it, and who had always maintained respectful relationships with his neighbors regardless of their background. She drew what she saw. She drew the Navajo women at the trading post in Cimarron, their dignity and the weight of what they had survived visible in the set of their shoulders. She drew the Spanish-speaking families who had been on this land for generations, who navigated the peculiar indignity of being called newcomers on land their great-grandparents had worked. She drew all of it because she believed that the obligation of someone who paid attention was to bear witness. In 1881, a man named Clayton Greer bought the large Cowboy spread to the south, the same Cowboy who had tried to dam Marshall's Creek years before. Cowboy had finally overextended himself and sold, and Greer was a different kind of man, the kind who arrived in a territory with money and lawyers, and the assumption that these two things entitled him to arrange the landscape to his convenience. He made immediate overtures about buying Marshall's northern water rights, which Marshall declined with civility and firmness, and Greer made it clear, through the particular code of territorial business dealings, that he did not consider the matter closed. It was not a pleasant situation. There was a period of 3 months that winter when Wilhelmina could see the tension in Marshall's shoulders every time he came in from the day's work, the particular set of a man who was watching his perimeter. She did not ask him to minimize it or pretend it was other than it was. She sat with him in the evenings after James was in bed, and they talked about it with the same directness they applied to everything, working through the options, the legal and the practical, and she was glad they were the kind of people who worked through things together. It was, in the end, resolved through the territorial court for the second time, with the help of the lawyer who had arrived in Redemption Creek and who turned out to be, in the best possible sense, exactly the kind of person who enjoyed winning legal arguments on behalf of people who were clearly in the right. Greer got nothing. The water rights stayed exactly where they were. Greer eventually decided that the territory had better opportunities elsewhere and sold to a family named Morales, who were quiet and fair, and with whom the Warrens had an entirely uncomplicated relationship from the first day. James Warren was 3 when his sister was born, in the summer of 1882. They named her Clara Rose. Clara because Wilhelmina had a friend in Indiana named Clara who had pressed novels into her hands and been the best kind of steadfast, and Rose because of the climbing rose that had taken hold on the south wall of the house and produced every June a cascade of blossoms so extravagant they looked like something from a painting. Clara was from the beginning entirely unlike her brother, which was the funniest and most wonderful thing about her. Where James was loud and forward and put himself into everything immediately, Clara was an observer, a baby who lay in her basket and watched the world with enormous dark eyes with the focused attention of someone conducting a serious study. She would grow into a child who collected information about her environment with a patience and thoroughness that made her father nod with recognition and made her mother laugh and say, "You see, this is what I was like." The house felt full now in the way that Wilhelmina had not known she was building toward but recognized immediately as the thing she had wanted, the particular fullness of a life that had people in it who needed her and whom she needed, a texture of days made up of small and significant moments woven together into something that held. Marshall Warren, in the summer of 1882, added a second room to the house. He and Felipe and Jed Carver, who could always be counted on for a building project, spent 3 weeks in the August heat raising the adobe walls and setting the timber for the roof. Wilhelmina made sure they were fed and watered throughout, and she sat on the porch in the evenings with Clara on her lap, watching the 3 men review the day's work with the satisfaction of people doing a thing together in the right way. When the room was finished, Marshall put a window on the east-facing wall, looking toward the mountains, and told Wilhelmina it was hers, a room of her own, for drawing, with the light she needed. She stood in the new room in the morning light with the mountains in the window and felt the particular fullness of being known. She was known by this man. He had understood what she needed and built it for her with his own hands, and she thought about the letter in the back of her father's desk, and the 4 years and the 3 states and the gray mare on the ridge, and she thought that every single difficult thing had been worth it completely. She set up her table under the east window and arranged her charcoal and her inks and her sketchbooks, and she sat down and drew what she saw, which was the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in August morning light, rose and gold and vast and hers. The years that followed had the quality of a river finding its full course. There were seasons of difficulty and seasons of abundance, which was the nature of ranching life, and the Warren spread had both in their turn. There was a bad drought in 1883 that cost them 20 head and tested the water situation more seriously than any legal dispute, and Marshall and Felipe and the Morales family to the south worked together on a reservoir project that got them through it. There was an extraordinary spring in 1885 when the calf crop was the best in the spread's history, and the hay was thick, and the creek ran full, and Marshall stood in his fields in May looking at everything he had built, and she stood beside him, and understood that this was what happiness actually looked like. Not the dramatic proclamation of novels, but the quiet satisfaction of a man looking at his own work in a good year. James started school at the Redemption Creek Schoolhouse in the autumn of 1884. At 5 years old, walking the 6 miles each way with Felipe's youngest brother Miguel, who was 8, and had appointed himself James's guide with the seriousness of someone who understood that younger children required supervision. James came home from his first week of school with a list of new facts he needed to share immediately and the beginning of a friendship with a boy named Robert Vasquez, from the family to the north, that would prove to be the enduring friendship of his childhood. Wilhelmina's drawings had, by 1884, begun to find a wider audience than she had expected. It had started when Dr. Sutton asked her if he could send 2 of her drawings of the territory landscape to his brother in St. Louis, who was an editor at a periodical. The brother had published them with a brief note about their provenance, drawings by a woman rancher in New Mexico Territory, and the response had been enough that the periodical asked for more. She sent them what she had, and they published 8 drawings over the course of a year, and then a publisher in Chicago wrote to ask if she had enough for a book. She and Marshall sat at the kitchen table with the publisher's letter and read it twice, and then looked at each other. "A book," he said. "A book," she said. "Your drawings," he said, in the tone of someone who had always believed this was only a matter of time, which was one of the things she loved most about him. She wrote back to the publisher and said she would need a year to assemble the full collection she had in mind, and the publisher agreed. And for that year she spent her mornings in the east-facing room with the mountain window putting together a set of drawings that told the truth about the territory as she had found it, the land and the light and the people in all their complexity, the beauty and the difficulty and the humanity of it. The book was published in 1886. It was called, at the publisher's suggestion and her agreement, New Mexico Territory, Drawings from the High Desert, by Wilhelmina Collins Warren. It was not a famous book, not immediately, but it found readers who cared about it, and she received letters from people in cities who said it had shown them a world they had not known to imagine, and from people in the territory who said it looked like home. Marshall had a copy on the shelf next to his agricultural texts and his novels, and she had seen him take it down more than once and open it to a page, and sit with it for a moment in the quiet way he had with things that mattered to him. She did not make a point of it when she saw him do this. She simply loved him for it. Clara Warren, at 4 years old, announced that she wanted to learn to ride a horse. She made this announcement to her father at breakfast with the certainty of a person stating a fact rather than making a request, and Marshall Warren looked at his daughter across the table and said that she could start learning that afternoon, which was the correct answer. He taught her himself, the way he did most things he cared about, with patience and steadiness, and no suggestion that it was remarkable for a girl to want the same things her brother had. James, who was already a confident writer at 7, declared himself Clara's official supervisor in this endeavor, a role Clara accepted with the tolerance of someone who recognized the usefulness of a supervisor while not feeling particularly supervised. In 1887, Jed Carver was thrown from his horse during a cattle work and broke his arm badly enough that he could not run the spread for 3 months. Ruth Carver was already managing more than she should, with 4 children and a household, and the Warren spread, and the Morales family and Eleanor Hatch and the Vasquez family all took turns helping with the Carver cattle through the late summer and autumn. It was the kind of effort that happened in a community that had learned it was in each other's interest to hold each other up. And Jed Carver, by winter, was back on his feet and had told Marshall Warren that he owed him more than he could calculate. And Marshall had said that Jed was going to be in the position to help someone else eventually, and that was how the calculation worked. Eleanor Hatch, who had been alone on her spread since her husband's death a decade before, announced in the spring of 1888 that she was marrying the doctor, Dr. Sutton, who had been wanting to ask her for 2 years and had finally, in Alina's word, worked up the required initiative. The wedding was in the small white church, and Wilhelmina was Alina's witness, and the party afterward was held at the Warren spread in the last of the spring warmth, with lanterns strung from the corral fence and the fiddle player from 10 years back, older now but still in possession of the same songs, and Alina Hatch became Alina Sutton with a satisfaction that was visible from every angle. Wilhelmina danced with Marshall in the lamplight, as she had at their own wedding, and James danced with Clara in the awkward, enthusiastic way of a 10-year-old and his 8-year-old sister, and the mountains were dark against the stars, and the party went long into the night. She was 34 years old, standing in a spread in New Mexico territory on a spring evening with her husband's hand in hers and her children dancing, and she thought about a boarding house in Indiana and a man who had stayed 11 days, and changed the fixed point of her internal compass so completely that 4 years of patient waiting and 3 states of difficult travel had simply been the geography between where she was and where she needed to be. She had crossed 3 states to find a man who did not know she was coming. He had been worth every mile. In the autumn of 1888, when Clara was 6 and James was 9, and the spread was running better than it ever had, and the east-facing room had a second sketchbook in the works for a publisher who was requesting whatever she would send, Wilhelmina Collins Warren sat on the porch in the October evening and watched her husband come in from the day's work. He unsaddled his horse at the corral and turned it in with the same ease she had watched him move with since that first morning, the same untheatrical competence. He stopped at the pump and washed his hands and his face and came up the porch steps and sat in the chair beside her without a word, because they had been married long enough to know when silence was the right thing. The mountains were going purple in the dusk. The kitchen light fell warm from the window behind them. Inside the house she could hear James explaining something to Clara with the emphatic delivery of a boy who had recently discovered that he knew things, and Clara's measured, skeptical responses, and the particular sound of 2 children who were genuinely fond of each other being genuinely fond of each other in the loudest possible way. Marshall Warren reached over and took her hand. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, the way he always looked at the mountains in this light, but there was a smile at the corner of his mouth that she had put there. She could tell the difference after 10 years between all his smiles, and this one was hers specifically. She thought about the letter. She thought about her father keeping it behind the board, and she thought that she had spent some time being angry about that and some time grieving it, and that she was no longer either of those things. The anger had burned itself out in the practical fire of getting from Indiana to here, and the grief had been quieted by the years that followed, by the fullness of them. You could not properly mourn the years you had lost when the years you had found were the life you were actually living, the particular and irreplaceable life of Wilhelmina Collins Warren, wife and mother and artist and rancher's partner in New Mexico territory in 1888, with her husband's hand in hers and the mountains going dark and the light coming warm from the windows of the life they had built. "Do you know," she said to him, "what I am going to draw tomorrow?" "Tell me," he said. "This," she said, "exactly this. The porch and the light from the window and the mountains." He looked at her. "Am I in it?" "You are in everything I draw," she said, "whether you are in the picture or not." He looked at her for a moment with that open, unguarded expression she had first seen on a ridge above a ranch and that she had been the recipient of for 10 years, and that she still felt in the same place in her chest every time. "Wilhelmina Collins," he said, the way he had said it that first day on the ridge, her name in his voice like something coming home. "Marshall Warren," she said back. They sat on the porch as the last light left the mountains and the stars came out one by one over New Mexico territory. And inside the house, their children argued and laughed, and the fire kept its comfortable counsel, and outside the horses moved in the corral, and the night settled over the land with the deep, soft authority of a thing that had been doing this for a very long time and would continue to do so long after all of them were gone. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world, exactly as it was supposed to be. She had crossed 3 states to find a man who did not know she was coming. She had found him and he had found her, and they had built their life on this high desert land with its enormous sky and its red mountains. And the life they had built was good and full and real, and it was theirs entirely, and it would go on. In the spring of 1889, when the kitchen garden was coming up green, and the calf crop was strong, and the climbing rose on the south wall was beginning its annual extravagance, James Warren, 10 years old and serious about learning, stood on the ridge above the spread with his father and looked out at the land they would one day ask him to help tend, and asked Marshall how he had come to have all of this. Marshall Warren stood on the ridge in the spring morning light and thought about this question. "I built what I could," he said, "and your mother came and showed me what it was worth having." James considered this. "She came from Indiana," he said. "She crossed 3 states," Marshall said, "to find me. I did not know she was coming." James looked out at the mountains. "Were you glad?" Marshall looked back toward the house, where smoke was rising from the chimney and Clara's voice could be heard telling the barn cat something it needed to know, and where Wilhelmina Collins Warren was in her east-facing room with the mountain window, making true the world she saw in charcoal and ink. "Every single day," he said. The spring sun was warm on the ridge, and the mountains were clear all the way to the eastern horizon, and the land below them was their own, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.